In a small, peaceful town, people lived simple lives. There were no tall buildings or busy streets. The community center was one of the busiest places in town, where children played and adults gathered for different activities. One sunny afternoon, something unusual was about to happen there. Elliot Masters, a famous mathematics professor from the city, had come to the community center to give a special workshop. He was well known for his sharp mind, his strict rules, and his proud nature. People often said he was the smartest man they had ever met. Students from nearby towns came to listen to him. They filled the small hall, carrying notebooks and pencils, eager to learn something new. In the corner of the room sat Clara, a quiet woman in her 30s. She wore a simple dress and carried a small notebook, not for studying, but for writing down shopping lists and small thoughts. Clara wasn't there to learn about numbers or big ideas. She worked at the community center as a cleaner, and she had finished cleaning early that day. Out of curiosity, she decided to sit and watch the workshop for a while. No one noticed her. She was used to that. Clara liked the quiet corners, where she could watch people without being seen. Numbers had always made sense to her, but she never spoke about it. Long ago, she had studied mathematics in school and had even gone to university, but life had taken a different turn. Now she cleaned floors, dusted shelves, and quietly solved puzzles in her head while mopping the floor. Professor Masters walked into the room, tall and serious, carrying a bag full of books and papers. He stood at the front and started to speak about the beauty of mathematics. His voice was strong, and the room fell silent as he talked about difficult problems that only the brightest minds could solve. After a while, the professor wanted to test the room. He liked showing his cleverness by asking hard questions. He picked a complicated math problem and said he would choose someone to solve it in front of everyone. The students looked around nervously, not wanting to be picked. Then Professor Masters' eyes fell on Clara. To him, she looked like someone who didn't belong there. Perhaps he thought it would be amusing to watch her struggle. With a slight smile, he pointed to her and said, "You there, come and try this." The room went quiet. Some students looked confused. A few chuckled under their breath. Clara looked up, surprised. For a moment, she thought he might be speaking to someone else. But no, all eyes were on her now. She hesitated, her heart beating a little faster. But there was something in the professor's face, a certain smugness, that made her stand up. She gave a small, polite nod and slowly walked toward the front of the room. Clara stood in front of the room, holding a piece of chalk in her hand. The smooth, cold surface felt strange between her fingers. It had been many years since she had touched a chalkboard, but her hand remembered the weight of it. The room was silent, except for the soft sound of the ceiling fan spinning above. Professor Masters stood beside the board, tall and proud, with a look on his face that said he was sure Clara would fail. He pointed to the problem he had written. It was long and messy, full of numbers, letters, and strange symbols, the kind of problem that made most people's heads spin. "Go ahead," he said, his voice calm, but with a hint of laughter hiding inside it. The students in the room leaned forward, their eyes wide. Some of them were already whispering to each other. They were sure Clara had no chance. After all, she was just a cleaner. How could she understand something so difficult? Clara looked at the problem. For a moment, everything around her faded away. She didn't hear the whispers, didn't see the faces watching her. All she saw were the numbers and symbols on the board. It didn't scare her. They made sense in a way words sometimes didn't. She read the question carefully. It was a puzzle, really. A tricky one, but one she understood. Clara took a small step closer and started to write. Her hand moved slowly at first, then faster as the answer formed in her mind. Each number she wrote, each line she drew, was sure and steady. The students stopped whispering. Their eyes followed every move Clara made. They didn't understand what was happening. How could she be so calm? How could she even know where to start? Professor Masters watched too. His smile faded little by little as he followed the work on the board. Clara's steps were clear and correct. She wasn't guessing or copying. She was solving. When Clara finished the last line, she put the chalk down gently and stepped back. She didn't say anything. Her work spoke for itself. The room was completely silent now. Even the fan above seemed quieter. One of the students finally spoke. Is that right?" she asked. her voice soft and unsure. Professor Masters didn't answer right away. He stepped closer to the board and read Clara's solution carefully. His eyes moved over every number, every symbol. A frown appeared on his face. The problem was not only solved, it was done in a clear, elegant way, one that even he hadn't thought of. He cleared his throat and turned to look at Clara, but she wasn't smiling or showing off. She stood quietly, her hands folded in front of her, waiting. The students looked back and forth between the professor and Clara, not sure what would happen next. Professor Masters stood still in front of the board, his mouth slightly open, staring at Clara's solution. It was as if time had stopped for a moment. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint ticking of a clock in the corner. Clara's simple, clean lines of math had completely erased the chaos of the original problem. What she had done was unexpected, even impossible, for most people. Elliot Masters blinked, then shook his head as if to clear it. He looked at the board again, double-checking, but it didn't change. The numbers were correct. The answer was right. He turned to the students, his voice suddenly unsure. Is this correct? He asked, but the question was directed more at himself than anyone else. The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at one another. No one knew what to say. They had seen Clara walk to the board with nothing more than a quiet presence. But now they saw something else, something they hadn't expected. It was as if a hidden power had been revealed. No one in the room, except for Clara, seemed to understand what had just happened. After a long pause, one of the students raised her hand. Professor, I think it's correct, she said, but her voice didn't carry the usual confidence it would have had before. Elliot's face grew darker, the realization settling in. He had underestimated Clara. He had thought of her as just another person in the back of the room, someone who didn't belong. And yet she had done what even some of his brightest students couldn't do. He looked back at Clara, who stood there quietly, her face neutral. She wasn't smiling, wasn't gloating. It was as though solving the problem was the most natural thing in the world for her. Her calmness was almost unsettling. How did you? Professor Masters started, then stopped. He couldn't quite finish the sentence. The answer was obvious now, but it still didn't make sense. Clara finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. I just saw the pattern, she said simply. It's all about the steps, one by one. If you follow them, the solution reveals itself. The words were simple, but they hung in the air like a mystery. The students were confused, unsure of what she meant. They didn't see the pattern she spoke of. To them, it was just a complicated mess of numbers and symbols. But Clara's eyes had seen something different. The professor couldn't speak for a few moments. He cleared his throat again and turned back to the students, his mind still racing. He had never expected this. He had never expected that a woman who had only been a cleaner in the back of the room could have solved one of the toughest problems he had given. He was a teacher, but in that moment, he realized that sometimes the teacher had something to learn too. Elliot Masters stood in front of the board, his mind racing. He couldn't understand how Clara had solved the problem so easily. He had spent weeks thinking about that equation, and even his best students had struggled to find a clean solution. But Clara? She had done it in a few minutes, without even hesitating. The room remained still, the students staring at Clara in disbelief. They had all expected her to fail, to stumble over the numbers and give them something to laugh about. But now, it felt different. Some of them were starting to look at her with new eyes, unsure of how to react. Clara, Professor Masters said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was softer than before, almost respectful. How did you know how to do that? Clara's gaze remained calm, her hands still folded in front of her. She wasn't excited or proud. In fact, she looked almost distant. She was used to being overlooked, used to being the quiet one in the background. Nothing about this moment seemed to faze her. It's just numbers, she said quietly, her voice gentle but steady. They all fit together in a way that makes sense, once you know where to look. Elliot felt a small pang of embarrassment. How could he, with all his years of experience and education, have missed something so simple? He had spent years chasing after complex solutions, thinking he had all the answers. But Clara, with her calm, almost effortless approach, had shown him something he had never considered. The students were still staring at Clara, their eyes wide with curiosity. They didn't know what to make of this sudden shift. Clara wasn't the kind of person they expected to have the answers. She wasn't a well-dressed, confident academic like the professors they were used to. But here she was, solving one of the hardest problems with a quiet confidence that seemed to make the entire room rethink their assumptions. You, you really think it's that easy? One of the students asked, still trying to understand. Clara nodded slowly. It's not about being easy, she said. It's about understanding what the numbers are telling you. Once you see that, the answer comes. Elliot turned back to the board, his eyes scanning the problem once more. But it wasn't just the problem on the board that had changed. His whole perspective had shifted. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain about his own knowledge, about what he thought he understood. He had always been proud of his ability to teach. His lectures were sharp, his explanations clear. But Clara had shown him that sometimes teaching wasn't about knowing everything. Sometimes it was about seeing things in a way others couldn't. And Clara had done just that. He looked at her again, this time with a hint of admiration in his eyes. I think I have a lot to learn, he admitted, his voice quieter now. Thank you, Clara. Clara simply nodded, a small, humble smile on her face. She wasn't looking for praise or recognition. She was just doing what came naturally to her. For her, solving math problems was just another way to make sense of the world. The room was still quiet, but now the mood had changed. It wasn't just confusion anymore. There was a new feeling in the air. The students were looking at Clara differently. Some were amazed, others curious, and a few were even a little ashamed. No one had expected this, certainly not from her. Elliot Masters stood off to the side, still processing what had just happened. He was no longer the confident professor he had been when he entered the room. Instead, he was a little unsure, questioning everything he thought he knew about teaching, learning, and intelligence. How had he missed this? How had he not seen the potential in Clara? Clara, he said, his voice quieter this time, where did you learn to do this? Clara didn't look up right away. She glanced down at her hands, then back at the floor. It seemed like a simple question, but for her, the answer wasn't easy. Her life hadn't been about classrooms or textbooks for a long time. It had been about survival, making ends meet, and keeping a low profile. She wasn't a student anymore. She wasn't a professor. She was just a woman who had loved numbers since she was a child. I studied math. Once, she said softly, her voice almost lost in the stillness. A long time ago. There was a brief silence before one of the students spoke up. You went to university? Clara nodded. Yes, for a few years. But life didn't go the way I planned. I had to leave. The students were listening now, leaning in. They hadn't expected this. They had assumed she was just an ordinary woman, someone who didn't fit into the world of numbers and equations. But now they were beginning to see that there was more to Clara than they had realized. Elliot watched her carefully. And after you left, what happened? He asked, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of a real desire to understand her story. Clara took a deep breath, glancing around the room before meeting his gaze. I worked a lot of different jobs, she said. Cleaning, serving, anything that helped pay the bills. But I never stopped thinking about math. It's always been with me in the background, even when I wasn't doing anything with it. Elliot's expression softened, and for the first time, he felt a sense of respect for her. Clara had never sought attention or recognition. She hadn't been looking for a chance to show off her skills. She had simply been living her life, quietly solving problems in her head when no one was watching. And now here she was, teaching him a lesson he would never forget. The students were still whispering to each other, processing everything they had just learned. Some looked impressed, others a little embarrassed. It was clear that this experience had left an impact on all of them, but none of them would forget what Clara had done today. You know, Elliot said slowly, turning to address the class, sometimes we get so caught up in the idea of what a math genius looks like that we forget it doesn't always come in the package we expect. The students nodded, a new understanding settling in. They hadn't just learned about math today. They had learned something much deeper about people, about assumptions, and about the unexpected brilliance that can exist in the most unassuming places. The air in the room had changed. What began as a quiet, awkward moment now felt like something more profound. Clara stood at the front, still as calm as ever, while the students slowly began to talk among themselves. Some of them whispered excitedly, eager to know more about her, to understand how someone like Clara could be so brilliant at something so complex. Others, however, were still trying to come to terms with the fact that she had solved a problem that most of them couldn't. Elliot Masters had never felt so uncertain in his life. For years, he had stood at the front of classrooms, lecturing about the importance of formal education, of qualifications, of how one had to work hard to achieve mastery in a subject. Yet here was Clara, with no degrees, no fancy degrees hanging on her walls, solving problems with a quiet simplicity that made everything he knew feel almost irrelevant. He cleared his throat. Clara, he began, trying to steady his voice. I have to admit, I never expected this from you. How did you learn to see things the way you do? Clara didn't hesitate. I didn't learn it, Professor, she said, her voice soft but firm. It's just always been a part of me. Math isn't something I had to study. It's something I've always understood. It's just in the way things fit together. Elliot blinked, not fully understanding. For him, math had always been a subject that required intense study, hours of practice, and textbooks filled with complicated theories. Yet for Clara, it seemed to come naturally, as if the language of numbers was simply a part of her, woven into the fabric of her thinking. So, you've never thought about coming back to university? Elliot asked, almost as if speaking more to himself than to her. Clara shrugged slightly. I thought about it, she admitted. But my life went in another direction. I needed to work, to help out my family. There just wasn't any time for school, and honestly, I don't think I needed it, not to understand math. The students looked at her with a mix of admiration and disbelief. They had grown up hearing over and over that in order to truly succeed, you needed a degree, the right credentials, the right connections. Clara had none of those things. Yet here she was, solving problems that many of them couldn't even begin to understand. Clara, one of the students asked hesitantly, do you ever think about teaching? I mean, you clearly know this stuff better than most of us. Clara smiled gently, shaking her head. I never really thought about it. I don't need to teach anyone anything. If people want to learn, they will. They just have to listen, really listen, to the way numbers talk to them. That's all there is to it. Her answer was simple, but it carried weight. Clara wasn't driven by fame or recognition. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She simply had a gift, and her approach to life had always been one of quiet confidence, not seeking the spotlight, but letting her actions speak for themselves. Elliot stood there, humbled. He had spent his career thinking he was the one with all the answers. But Clara had shown him something he hadn't even considered, that sometimes true brilliance doesn't need to be polished or packaged in a way people expect. Sometimes it's just about being who you are and letting your mind do the rest. He nodded slowly, finally saying, Thank you, Clara, for showing us all something important today. Clara simply smiled again, as if it were no big deal. But for the students in the room, for Elliot, and for herself, it was a moment they would not forget. The room was filled with an energy that wasn't there before. The students, still recovering from the shock of Clara's brilliant solution, now found themselves questioning everything they had believed about what it meant to be a math genius. As the murmurs began to quiet down, Professor Elliot Masters stood in front of the class, trying to gather his thoughts. He had come here with the intention of teaching, of showing his students how to think through complex problems. But now he felt like the student himself. Clara, the quiet woman in the back, had done something none of them had expected. And somehow, it felt like she had taught them more than the math problem on the board ever could. Clara, Elliot said, his voice sounding different now, softer, more respectful. I have to ask, what made you walk into this room today? Why didn't you stay in the back like you always do? Clara didn't seem surprised by the question. She paused, considering her answer carefully. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, and she certainly didn't crave it. But today had turned out to be different. I didn't plan on coming up here, she said, glancing around at the students who were still watching her closely. But when you called on me, I thought, maybe it was a chance to show that things aren't always what they seem. You know, that everyone has something special in them, even if it's not obvious. Her words hung in the air, a simple truth that seemed so easy, yet so hard for others to see. Clara hadn't come to show off her skills or to challenge the professor. She had just walked up because she knew she could solve the problem and maybe, just maybe, show everyone that there was more to her than they thought. Elliot nodded slowly. He had thought he knew everything about teaching, about inspiring others. But Clara had turned everything he thought he knew upside down. He hadn't just underestimated her. He had assumed that her quiet nature meant a lack of intelligence, when in reality, it was just a different kind of brilliance. One of the students, a young man who had been silently observing, raised his hand. "Clara," he said, his voice filled with curiosity, "if you knew all this, why did you keep it to yourself? Why not go back to school? You could have been a professor too." Clara looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "I didn't need to be a professor," she said softly. "I didn't need anyone to tell me what I was capable of. Sometimes the world doesn't notice you, and that's okay. I've always been content doing what I do, helping people in my own way." Her answer struck a chord with the room. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It wasn't about fitting into the mold that society expected. It was about being true to yourself and finding your own path, even if no one was looking. Elliot glanced around the room, seeing the students' faces filled with new understanding. Some of them had started out skeptical, unsure of Clara's abilities. Now they were filled with a sense of wonder, as if they had just been introduced to a new way of thinking. For the first time in a long while, Elliot felt like a student, ready to learn from someone who had no need for titles or accolades. "Thank you, Clara," he said again, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've taught us all something very important today." Clara simply smiled, as if it were nothing special. To her, it wasn't. She hadn't done anything extraordinary. She had just been herself. And in that moment, that was more than enough. The class was over, but the atmosphere in the room hadn't shifted. The students were still talking among themselves, processing everything that had happened. Their whispers weren't the usual chatter after a lesson. This time, there was a sense of awe, of respect that hadn't been there before. Clara had not only solved a complicated math problem, but she had also opened their eyes to something bigger than equations. Elliot Masters stood at the front of the room, feeling like the lesson wasn't over. In fact, he wasn't sure the lesson would ever be truly over. He watched Clara as she gathered her things, completely unaware of the ripple she had caused. For her, it had been a simple thing. She had just walked to the board, solved the problem, and returned to her quiet, unassuming self. But for the others, everything had changed. "Clara," Elliot said, walking over to her as she was about to leave the room. His voice was calm, but there was a genuine curiosity there. "I have to ask, do you ever think about what could have happened if you stayed in school? If you had pursued a career in math?" Clara paused for a moment, her bag in hand. She glanced at him, a soft smile on her face. "I don't regret the way things turned out," she said simply. "I have my life, my work. Math was never about a career for me. It was always just something I loved, something that made sense when nothing else did." Elliot nodded slowly, understanding her answer even if it didn't fit the mold he was used to. She hadn't needed the recognition, the title, the path that everyone else followed. For her, math was something personal, something that brought her peace in a world that didn't always make sense. "I think you've taught us all something today," Elliot said, his voice quieter now. "That sometimes the best minds aren't the ones with the degrees or titles. Sometimes they're the ones who don't need to prove anything. They just know." Clara shrugged lightly, looking at the door as she moved toward it. "I never really thought about proving anything," she said. "I just do what I do. I think the world has a way of showing who we really are, whether we wanted to or not." Elliot stood there, watching as Clara left the classroom, her steps quiet, just like her presence had always been. The students were still talking among themselves, sharing their thoughts, their feelings about what had just happened. They were looking at Clara with new respect, and for some of them, that was a hard thing to accept. They had spent so much of their lives believing that success could only come through the traditional path, the degrees, the titles, the visible proof of hard work. But Clara had shown them something different, that sometimes brilliance wasn't about what you could show the world. It was about what you could quietly do when no one was looking. As the students slowly filed out of the room, Elliot remained standing by the board. He turned to look at the complex math problem still written there. But now, it felt different. It wasn't just a puzzle anymore. It was a symbol of how easily people could overlook the hidden talents around them, how they could miss the quiet brilliance that could be found in unexpected places. Elliot smiled to himself, realizing that he had learned something far more valuable than any equation or theory. He had learned that sometimes the most powerful lessons didn't come from textbooks or lectures. Sometimes they came from people like Clara, people who didn't need to prove anything to anyone, and yet, in the end, proved everything.